If you had walked by Joseph Redwood on that frigid December morning, you might have mistaken him for every other homeless person on the bustling Chicago streets, just another soul lost in a sea of faces. But Joseph was no ordinary man, and his path would cross with a billionaire's in a way no one could have anticipated. It was a chance encounter that sparked a series of events so dramatic, so astonishing, that the entire world would soon be watching. Destiny, ambition, betrayal, and hope collided that day, unveiling secrets powerful enough to change countless lives forever. Joseph Redwood was 38 years old, though his wind-chapped face and streaks of silver hair made him look a decade older. He hadn't always lived this way. In fact, his early life showed all the promise of a bright future. The son of a middle school librarian and an electrician, Joseph excelled in math and science, earning a scholarship to a well-respected state university. But a chain of misfortunes, his mother's illness, his father's job loss, and a financial crisis that decimated their savings, drove him to take out massive loans. Then came a series of personal tragedies that left him, step by step, in a downward spiral. He lost his fiancée in a car accident, abandoned his academic pursuits, and found himself distanced from everyone he'd ever known. Pride prevented him from seeking help, and heartbreak only exacerbated his fall. As the years went by, Joseph drifted from odd job to odd job, never able to hold down stable employment. With no family to rely on and no savings to speak of, he ended up in a homeless shelter. Yet, even under such dire circumstances, a stubborn flicker of hope lingered in Joseph's soul. Each evening, he devoured newspapers and rummaged through half-torn magazines that wealthy households discarded. He closely followed economic trends, scientific breakthroughs, and philanthropic endeavors. It was as though he believed knowledge alone might be the rope that could pull him out of his pit of despair. One December morning, Chicago's wind was merciless, slicing through coats and flesh alike. Joseph had spent the night in a makeshift tent under an expressway. Sleepless, he rose before dawn and wandered downtown, hoping to be first in line at the local soup kitchen. On his way, he spotted a swarm of cameras and a crowd gathering around a shiny black limousine in front of the Tribune Tower. People were murmuring with excitement, "That's him! He's here for a major announcement." Curious, Joseph approached. Stepping out of the limousine was Thomas Wilder, the elusive and famously private billionaire who had lately been featured in every business column across the nation. Rumor had it he was planning a colossal investment in Chicago's tech and finance scene, though nothing official had been confirmed. Joseph had read rumors about Wilder's philanthropic leanings, that he'd once donated an entire hospital wing in Boston and sponsored a rural education project in India. His net worth, over $50 billion, thanks to a global conglomerate of companies in solar energy, financial tech, and even digital healthcare solutions. Joseph stared, something in him stirring. A man so obscenely wealthy, so lauded for his generosity, yet so wrapped in mystery, could actually be the key to his own salvation. He rushed forward, ignoring the baffled looks from onlookers, and found himself only a few feet away from the reclusive billionaire. At first, the bodyguards tried to push him back, but something in Joseph's eyes must have given them pause. Perhaps they'd seen that desperate mix of fear and determination in others before. "Please, Mr. Wilder, just a moment." Joseph's voice trembled, as he was unsure if he could be heard over the sea of reporters. Thomas Wilder turned, his expression guarded. For a moment, it looked as though he'd dismiss Joseph with a wave or allow a security guard to shove him aside. But an inexplicable curiosity tugged at Thomas. He was used to being accosted by wealthy investors, begging for partnerships, and opportunistic entrepreneurs, chasing a slice of his fortune. A homeless man, however, rarely had such audacity. Perhaps it was this contrast that made Wilder raise a single finger and signal his guards to hold off. "Speak," the billionaire said, his tone clipped but not unkind. Joseph tried to steady himself. His lips were parched and his breath came out in shaky spurts. "I need help," he managed. "Not just for me, for the homeless in this city. They say you're a philanthropist. My friends on the streets are dying one by one. The shelters are overwhelmed. The job programs are underfunded. There's hardly any real path out of this for us." Reporters shoved microphones in Joseph's direction. One of them asked, "Are you unemployed? What's your name? Where are you from?" Another jumped in, "Is this some kind of publicity stunt?" Thomas Wilder raised his hand again, silencing them. He studied Joseph's face with a critical eye, taking in the tattered coat, the mismatched shoes, and the hollow cheeks that told stories of hunger. The billionaire could have dismissed him. He could have slipped back into his limo. Instead, something about Joseph's presence lingered with him. After an agonizing pause, Wilder said, "Come inside. I have a press conference to do first." He turned, leaving Joseph to blink in stunned disbelief. The security detail carefully nudged Joseph along, and the crowd parted like the Red Sea. With cameras flashing, Joseph Redwood found himself stepping inside the Tribune Tower, trailing behind a man who was rumored to hold the power to reshape cities with the stroke of a pen. Thomas Wilder's press conference was short and surprisingly vague. He mentioned the intention to invest in local startups, strengthen philanthropic outreach, and build a better, brighter future for Chicago. He ignored pointed questions from journalists about the homeless man. Joseph stood by the side, under the watchful eye of the billionaire's security. After the conference concluded, Wilder gestured for Joseph to follow him down a quiet corridor. Once they were alone in a small side room, an elaborate office used by some high-ranking executive, Thomas Wilder regarded Joseph with cold, evaluating eyes. "So, Joseph Redwood, you want my help? You want me to create some philanthropic program, some safe haven?" Joseph swallowed. "The city's shelters are near collapse. People think that if you're homeless, you're lazy or incompetent, but that's not always the case. Some of us lost everything through no fault of our own families, jobs. I don't expect you to fix everything, but if you did something real, something that invests in us," he stammered, struggling to express a plan he'd never fully formed. That's when Thomas Wilder cut in, surprising Joseph. "Let's say I do. Let's say I commit to a shelter expansion program. Why should I trust you to be the one leading the charge? You're a man on the street, no credentials, no stable address, nothing. You think people will listen to you?" A wave of embarrassment flushed Joseph's cheeks. He knew the billionaire had a point. "Why, I have ideas. I've researched how some European nations run transitional programs. If we could adapt them here, we might save thousands of lives. I may not have official credentials anymore, but I was once a top student. I know how to coordinate resources. I just never got the chance." Thomas stared at him. "I'll give you a chance, Redwood. A single chance. You'll come with me to my next meeting with the Chicago Community Development Council. Let's see if your ideas hold water. If they do, maybe I'll fund them. If not, you go back to the streets." It was an offer Joseph never expected. Eyes welling with gratitude, he could scarcely believe what was happening. "Thank you, Mr. Wilder." Wilder cut him off, speaking briskly. "Don't thank me yet. This city is riddled with corruption. You'll face strong opposition from multiple directions, business owners, politicians, the public, and trust me, not everyone in my circle appreciates philanthropic ventures that don't turn a profit." Overwhelmed, Joseph simply nodded. That night, Joseph slept at a motel paid for by Thomas Wilder's assistant, his mind aflame with possibilities. He spent half the night writing down everything he could recall from the articles and studies he'd devoured over the years. A bold, if undercooked, blueprint took shape in those frantic scribbles. He doubted he could get it right in one go, but hope fueled him. Tomorrow, he would face a gathering of city officials, philanthropic advisors, and potentially the next wave of investors who would shape Chicago's future. The next day arrived in a blur of nervous excitement. Wilder sent a car to pick Joseph up at the motel. Decked in the only clean shirt, he had a wrinkled collared shirt from the free clothing drive. Joseph was ushered into a glass-walled conference room at a downtown skyscraper. Around the long mahogany table sat individuals whose names he recognized from newspaper bylines, city council members, CEOs of local charities, even Dr. Mary Thompson, a top researcher in social welfare programs from Boston University, who had consulted with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on rural education. She was widely respected for her no-nonsense approach and her penchant for exposing half-baked philanthropic efforts. Thomas Wilder, imposing and charismatic, opened the meeting with a brief statement. He wanted to fund a revolutionary project to alleviate homelessness in Chicago and possibly replicate the model across major American cities. Then he turned to Joseph Redwood and said, "This man has studied various programs and has insight into the day-to-day struggles people face on the streets. I've invited him here to share some ideas." Joseph could feel the weight of a dozen skeptical gazes. Summoning courage, he launched into his proposal. He spoke of transitional housing that included on-site medical services, mental health counseling, and job training programs. He cited a pilot program in Helsinki, Finland, known for its housing-first approach, as well as smaller initiatives in Salt Lake City. With each step, Joseph's voice grew steadier. Several attendees exchanged uncertain glances, but Dr. Mary Thompson leaned forward, her brow furrowed in intense concentration. "You're suggesting an approach that invests heavily up front, potentially tens of millions, to stabilize individuals rather than pushing them through scattered services. That's radical for Chicago," she remarked. Joseph nodded. "But the long-term savings can be enormous. Reduced emergency healthcare costs, reduced policing, and a higher chance of reintegrating people into the workforce. People who get off the street often start paying taxes, buying goods, contributing to the local economy." For a moment, the room was silent. Then the objections came. "We can't possibly scale this citywide. Where will the money come from if it expands? What about those who refuse help?" Thomas Wilder didn't move, didn't speak. His penetrating gaze never left Joseph, waiting to see if he would fold under pressure. But Joseph held his ground, addressing each concern as best he could. He suggested a pilot program in one of Chicago's struggling neighborhoods, a small test group with careful tracking of data. If it succeeded, they could expand, hopefully with the city's partial funding. At the end of the meeting, Dr. Mary Thompson smiled wryly. "Well, I'm intrigued. It's not the worst plan I've heard. Actually, it's refreshingly specific compared to the usual fluff." To Joseph's shock, Thomas Wilder stood, clapped Joseph on the back and declared, "We'll move forward with a pilot program." In the days that followed, local newspapers buzzed with rumors. The mysterious billionaire was actually forging a partnership with a homeless man. The tabloids swirled with sensational headlines. From the streets to the penthouse, Chicago homeless man gains billionaire's heir. Joseph found himself navigating an entirely new life. Wilder placed him under the guidance of a small philanthropic wing of Wilder Enterprises, where Joseph worked side by side with a handful of analysts who specialized in social impact. Yet not everyone was enthused. A faction of Wilder's board of directors balked at the potential costs with no guaranteed return on investment. One board member, Edward Clark, a powerful figure in the corporate finance arm, openly disdained philanthropic ventures. He preferred investment that yielded direct profit. Behind closed doors, he clashed with Wilder repeatedly, insisting that this pilot project was a publicity stunt bound to fail. Meanwhile, the city's political machinery groaned. While some officials welcomed the private funding, others worried about the optics of a wealthy businessman wielding influence over public welfare. The mayor's office sought assurances that city funds wouldn't be siphoned into a project benefiting only a select group. Joseph had to attend hearing after hearing, detailing how the pilot project's finances would be transparent. Amid all this chaos, Joseph found a surprising ally in Dr. Mary Thompson, who not only shared her wealth of research, but also introduced him to local community leaders. She admired his sincerity and recognized in him a deep understanding of life on the streets, an ingredient too often missing from top-down initiatives. Together, they hosted workshops and Q&A sessions to address concerns from residents in the chosen pilot neighborhood, an economically depressed area called West Fairview. 2 weeks into the planning, Joseph had a harrowing experience that changed everything. Late one night, while returning to his motel, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a man Joseph recognized from the homeless community, Darius, a recovering addict who'd been recently kicked out of a shelter for relapsing. With haunted eyes, Darius shoved Joseph against a wall and hissed, "You think you're better than us now? You're living large with that billionaire. You forgot where you came from." Joseph's heart pounded. "I haven't forgotten," he gasped. "This is for all of us. I'm trying to help." Darius loosened his grip, tears brimming in his bloodshot eyes. "Maybe you are, but guys like me, we don't stand a chance. The second I relapse, I'm tossed out. Nobody wants an addict around. You gotta remember us when you make your fancy plan." Shaken, Joseph promised he would. That night, he revised part of the pilot project to include specialized addiction recovery resources. He jotted notes until dawn, determined not to leave anyone behind. Soon, the pilot plan took final shape. It involved purchasing a run-down apartment complex in West Fairview, renovating it into transitional units, staffing it with social workers, medical professionals, and job counselors. Thomas Wilder pledged tens of millions in seed funding, and he pressed city officials to match some of it or provide tax incentives. The tension within Wilder Enterprises escalated. Edward Clark continued to sow doubt, whispering to other board members that the entire program was a vanity project doomed to crash. On the morning the pilot was officially launched, Joseph Redwood found himself standing in front of a crowd of city residents, news cameras, local officials, and philanthropic representatives. Thomas Wilder, stoic as ever, gave a short speech. "This is an experiment that dares to believe in people. If we succeed, we prove that homelessness doesn't have to be a fixed destiny. If we fail, we learn how to do better next time." As applause rippled, Joseph stepped to the podium, hands trembling. He stared out at faces both hopeful and skeptical. "My name is Joseph Redwood," he began. "I've been homeless in this city for years. I know what it's like to sleep in the cold and pray for a warm meal. I've also spent those years reading, learning, and dreaming about what could be done differently. This program is, in part, my dream." He outlined the pilot structure, emphasizing that its success hinged on the community's willingness to believe in second chances. When he finished, a wave of cautious optimism seemed to fill the air, yet behind the scenes, not all was well. Several wealthy developers in Chicago had set their sights on the West Fairview area for commercial projects. They saw the new transitional housing as a threat to property values and future investments in gentrification. A shadowy campaign began to bubble, with local business groups quietly lobbying city council members to derail or underfund the project. Rumors spread of bribery, of certain city officials being nudged to reject building permits or enforce impossible zoning regulations. Joseph started receiving subtle threats, anonymous letters slipped under his motel door, warning him to back off or pay the price. He brought them to Thomas Wilder, whose expression darkened like a gathering storm. "I've dealt with opposition before," Wilder said grimly, "but this is beyond typical corporate pushback. We need to be prepared." Shortly thereafter, Dr. Thompson discovered that some unscrupulous politicians were trying to pass a new city ordinance that would raise the legal requirements for transitional housing to almost impossible standards, specialized fire codes, parking lot expansions, and mandatory expansions to recreational areas regulations that sounded positive on paper, but would effectively bankrupt the pilot program. Joseph, Wilder, and Dr. Thompson rallied every contact they had to expose the plot. They reached out to respected local journalists, culminating in a damning expose published in the Chicago Tribune. Names were named, money trails tracked, and an uproar ensued. Citizens, now aware of the sabotage, flooded City Hall with phone calls and emails demanding that politicians support the homeless initiative. Even rival business moguls hesitated to continue their opposition, wary of being dragged into a public scandal. The ordinance was shelved. The pilot program continued, but the tension never entirely subsided. Edward Clark from within Wilder Enterprises tried a different tactic. He sought to undermine Joseph personally. Clark hired a private investigator to dig into Joseph's past, hoping to find dirt, a criminal record, or anything that could tarnish the pilot's public image. What they uncovered was not a crime, but something unexpected. Joseph had a twin sister, Elizabeth Redwood. Years ago, they'd become estranged after their parents' deaths. She'd fallen into debt, moved out of state, and disappeared from Joseph's life. Rumor had it she might have relocated to Canada. The investigator tracked her down, discovering that Elizabeth was now living in Toronto under a different surname, presumably to escape the stigma of bankruptcy she'd faced. Armed with this information, Edward Clark confronted Joseph at a board meeting, implying that if Joseph was so intent on healing families and communities, why had he abandoned his own sister? Joseph, blindsided and wounded, defended himself. "She left. She didn't want to be found. I tried to contact her for years." The confrontation shook Joseph. Self-doubt gnawed at him, and he wondered if the board and the public would perceive him as a hypocrite. Even Thomas Wilder's expression was unreadable, but Dr. Thompson came to Joseph's defense, publicly stating that no one should be judged solely by family rifts, especially in cases where mental health struggles or financial calamities cause people to isolate themselves. "You're taking a cheap shot, Clark," she snapped. "We're here to address homelessness in Chicago, not meddle in Redwood's personal heartbreak." The tension reached a boiling point. Despite mounting obstacles, the pilot project moved forward. Renovation of the old apartment complex in West Fairview sped along under Wilder's generous funding. Slowly, one by one, the city's homeless began to be offered rooms, counseling sessions, and job training. Local businesses, sensing a potential social success, cautiously warmed up to the initiative. Some even offered part-time jobs to participants. After 3 months, preliminary data surfaced. Hospitalization rates among the pilot participants dropped. A handful of families reunited. A small but growing percentage of participants found stable employment. The local media, initially skeptical, started publishing success stories. But with every step forward, there were rumors of sabotage lurking in the wings. One afternoon, Joseph was on site at the transitional complex when a frantic call came in. A water pipe had burst in the main building, flooding the first-floor units and rendering a dozen residents temporarily displaced. At first glance, it seemed like an accident, but an inspection revealed deliberate tampering. Pipes had been loosened, causing an artificial malfunction. Then, in the chaos, someone posted photos online purporting to show the facility in complete disarray, spinning the narrative that the pilot project was falling apart, rife with mismanagement. The scandal threatened to undo months of progress. Joseph felt despair creeping in. Thomas Wilder, however, was furious. He poured more money into immediate repairs, hired security to prevent further tampering, and launched a private internal investigation. Meanwhile, Dr. Thompson used her academic contacts to have neutral observers verify that the sabotage was deliberate. When the facts came to light, public sympathy roared in favor of the homeless facility. Edward Clark was forced to make a show of support or risk, looking complicit. He retreated into the background, but Joseph didn't let his guard down. He could sense that Clark, or perhaps other disgruntled parties, would strike again, if given the chance. In the midst of these mounting tensions, something remarkable happened. A resident named Margot, who had once lived in a tent city under an overpass, discovered she had a knack for software coding after taking some free classes offered in the pilot program. She created a rudimentary but compelling mobile app that matched job seekers with local businesses offering day labor or part-time gigs. Impressed, Joseph and Dr. Thompson pitched the concept to a philanthropic tech incubator. Within weeks, Margot received a modest grant to refine her app, and local businesses started using it. Soon, reporters caught wind of this small success and used it to illustrate how the pilot program wasn't just a one-way handout. It was fostering real innovation, giving people new skill sets, and encouraging them to contribute in creative ways. Wilder, seeing a spark of momentum, approached several major tech firms in Chicago, encouraging them to mentor pilot program participants in coding, data entry, or other digital skills. A handful agreed, seeking positive PR and potential new talent. As the West Fairview complex began to thrive, Joseph couldn't believe the transformation. What had once been a decrepit building was now teeming with life. Hallways bustled with residents heading to counseling appointments, job training sessions, or community building events. Children who had once known only shelter floors now had a place to call home. The success stories multiplied, and for the first time in years, Joseph felt truly alive. Yet, through it all, an internal storm churned in Joseph's mind, the news about his sister. He struggled with the guilt of not having found her sooner, of allowing their bond to vanish while he spiraled into homelessness. Late one night, Joseph mustered his courage and dialed the phone number the investigator had uncovered. Each ring sent a spike of anxiety through him, but he couldn't live in limbo any longer. To his shock, Elizabeth answered. Her voice shook with an emotion he couldn't quite place. Relief, fear, anger, possibly all three. Joseph? After all these years, is it really you? They spoke for hours. Elizabeth tearfully recounted how she'd run off to Canada to escape creditors and a crushing sense of shame. She'd heard vague rumors that Joseph had fallen on hard times, but had no idea how to reach him without dredging up her own painful past. The conversation ended with a promise to reconnect in person. A few days later, Elizabeth arrived in Chicago. Joseph was both thrilled and terrified to face her, but when she stepped off the bus, tears filled their eyes, and they embraced as though no time had passed. Thomas Wilder, curious about this reunion and mindful of Joseph's emotional state, invited Elizabeth to tour the facility at West Fairview. She was visibly moved by what she saw, and she thanked Wilder for believing in her brother when so many had not. With his sister now back in his life, Joseph felt more determined than ever to guard this fragile success story. Then came the bombshell. The city council announced that in 2 weeks there would be a critical vote on whether to partner with Wilder Enterprises to expand the pilot program citywide. This could unlock additional public funding and solidify the project's place in Chicago. But if the vote failed, the pilot would remain precariously reliant on Thomas Wilder's goodwill alone, and there was no guarantee that future city administrations would be cooperative. Sensing an all-or-nothing moment, Joseph and Dr. Thompson spearheaded a public awareness campaign. They arranged community events, published data-driven editorials, and mobilized supporters across social media. Margot's app garnered attention, showcasing how empowerment and opportunity could indeed flourish among those once written off by society. On the morning of the vote, a massive crowd gathered outside City Hall. Protesters demanding expanded services for the homeless stood on one side, while a smaller group of real estate moguls and concerned residents shouted that the plan was too costly and risky. News vans lined the street. Inside, city council members debated for hours. Politicians from both sides argued passionately, while Thomas Wilder and Joseph Redwood sat in the gallery, hearts pounding. Finally, the tally was read. By a narrow margin, the city council approved the partnership. The room erupted. Supporters cheered, hugging one another in joy and relief. Opponents scowled, muttering about the city's doomed budget. Joseph felt tears rolling down his cheeks. This was its validation that the city's leadership acknowledged the potential in the pilot project. In the aftermath, new developments rolled out swiftly. Additional transitional complexes were planned, land was allocated, and philanthropic groups from across the country reached out to learn more about Chicago's West Fairview model. Donations poured in, some from unexpected quarters. Even the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation sent a representative to discuss potential collaborations, and philanthropic luminaries mentioned it as a case study in their conferences. Of course, challenges loomed. The scale of the expansion was enormous, and not every complex would run perfectly. There would be logistical nightmares, inevitable political tussles, and outcries from communities resistant to having such facilities in their neighborhoods. But the tide had turned, and for the first time in decades, Chicago seemed determined to tackle homelessness with genuine conviction. Then the final shock arrived, the twist that truly left the world reeling. On an unassuming Thursday morning, Thomas Wilder announced he was transferring a sizable portion of his personal fortune, over $5 billion, into a new trust dedicated to eradicating homelessness in major U.S. cities. The trust would operate independently of Wilder Enterprises, shielding it from corporate politics. Joseph Redwood would be one of the leading advisors, with Dr. Thompson overseeing the research. Media outlets exploded with the news, describing it as one of the largest philanthropic moves in modern history. When pressed about his decision, Wilder revealed a part of his past he'd never spoken of publicly. As a child, his father had lost his small business, and for a short period, the family teetered on the brink of homelessness. They'd lived in a cramped trailer and survived by the goodwill of distant relatives. Wilder's eyes were uncharacteristically moist as he confessed, "I've always vowed to never let another person suffer because they're overlooked." Meeting Joseph Redwood reminded me of that vow. Suddenly, it all made sense. The elusive billionaire's philanthropic streak was not just for show. In Joseph, he had seen a mirror of the fragile circumstances that could upend anyone's life. Globally, the reaction was immense. Some lauded Wilder as a humanitarian hero, while others criticized him for not investing in solutions that could yield financial returns. But for Chicago's homeless population, hope was no longer just a fleeting dream. As the trust began its work, Joseph realized that his life had transformed beyond anything he could have imagined. No longer was he the man scrounging for meals in alleyways. He was a consultant and advocate, traveling to conferences in other cities, sharing the West Fairview story, brainstorming with policy experts, and ensuring that real people remained at the heart of every new initiative. And so it was that a single plea, Mr. Wilder, please help us, turned into a national campaign that shook the world. Saboteurs and skeptics still lingered on the periphery, but the momentum was too strong to be easily derailed. A once homeless man and a once impoverished boy turned billionaire had joined forces, proving that compassion and determination could rewrite destinies. In quieter moments, Joseph still slipped out of meetings to visit the transitional centers. He'd chat with families who reminded him of his own darkest days. He watched as children who might have otherwise known only the streets learned to read in brightly lit classrooms and discovered a warmth that Joseph wished he'd felt long ago. He kept in touch with Darius, who was now several months clean and serving as a peer mentor to incoming residents struggling with addiction. Darius would joke, "Guess one owe you an apology for that time I roughed you up." Joseph would simply laugh, deeply grateful that even the hardest cynics could turn a corner given the right help. Elizabeth stayed in Chicago, slowly rebuilding her life. She found an administrative job at one of the pilot sites and reconnected with Joseph. They spent weekends reminiscing about their parents, taking small steps to heal the scars that had festered for so long. As for Thomas Wilder, he remained an enigma in many ways, private, businesslike and stern, but over the months, he let Joseph see glimpses of the man behind the billions. He sometimes invited Joseph to dinner at his penthouse apartment, a lavish space with sweeping views of Lake Michigan. Over a glass of brandy, Wilder spoke of his father's struggles and how he'd learned to hide vulnerability behind a fortress of wealth. Joseph, in turn, spoke of the night he lost his fiancée and how that single tragedy had nearly undone him. Their bond was not exactly that of friends, perhaps more like comrades who had fought a common war against despair. Months turned into a year and then another. The pilot project expanded to neighboring states. Other millionaires and billionaires, intrigued or perhaps shamed by Wilder's bold moves, started their own philanthropic endeavors. The media breathlessly chronicled every twist and turn, occasionally dramatizing petty conflicts or sensationalizing minor setbacks. But by and large, the movement grew. Some labeled it the Redwood Wilder Revolution. Others remained skeptical, claiming that unless federal policy changed, local initiatives would always face funding crises. Joseph knew that the fight was far from over. But as he stood on a makeshift stage in another city council meeting, this time in Detroit, presenting data on how transitional housing had saved millions in public costs for Chicago, he saw a spark of real interest in the council members' eyes. He realized that what had started as a desperate plea had become a template for systemic change. What truly left the world in absolute shock was not just the donation of billions, or the sabotage attempts that were foiled, or even the city council drama. It was the unprecedented collaboration between a once homeless man and a billionaire with a guarded heart. Their alliance signaled that bridging vast socio-economic gaps was possible, that empathy and opportunity could form a powerful duo. And thus, a cold December morning on Chicago's streets gave birth to a story that would reverberate for decades. Joseph Redwood's life became a testament to human resilience, while Thomas Wilder's transformation from a secretive mogul to a public champion for the homeless became a beacon for other business titans. The real heroes, Joseph always insisted, were the countless homeless individuals who bravely stepped forward to rebuild their own lives once they were offered a chance, those who overcame addiction, trauma, and hopelessness to become active, contributing members of society. No one would have guessed that a single moment a homeless man stepping out of the crowd to beg for help would set all these events in motion. But that was the day the world changed. It was the day that hammered home the truth. Behind every statistic is a human story waiting to be heard, and behind every powerful fortune lies the possibility of doing immeasurable good. Sometimes all it takes is one improbable connection to shake entire cities from complacency and remind us that, in the end, we share far more in common than we ever imagined. Thank you for journeying through this extraordinary story of heartbreak, resilience, and the unstoppable power of compassion. From Joseph's desperate plea to Thomas Wilder's fearless stand against greed and doubt, we witnessed how one small act of empathy could spark a movement that changed countless lives. Now, we hope you'll carry this message forward. If this story inspired you, if it made you reflect on what truly matters, please show your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Each click broadens this conversation about second chances and amplifies the idea that no one is beyond hope. Together, let's continue to shine a light on the real challenges surrounding homelessness and on the profound transformations that can happen when we dare to believe in one another. Thank you for watching, and remember, the next story waiting to unfold could very well be yours.